I'm going to put dirt on your eye and you will see again. No one knew who the boy was, nor why he said that with such confidence. Days later, the blind boy described the sky, and no one could pretend nothing had happened. What truly occurred there? Trick, faith, or something even science dares not explain? If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Continuing on, the Ashford Mansion was located in Lincoln Park, one of Chicago's most exclusive neighborhoods, where every gate concealed stories that money couldn't solve. Edward Ashford was a man who had built an empire from scratch. He had started by selling car parts in a cramped stall on the South Side, and 30 years later, he commanded a network of dealerships spread across the state. His name was synonymous with success, his face graced business magazines, and his schedule was always full. But no signed contract, no Entrepreneur of the Year award, no multi-million-dollar expansion could fill the void that had taken over that house since Gabriel was born. Gabriel was 7 years old and had never run through the garden. He had never truly seen his mother's face, only felt the warmth of her hands when she held him with excessive care, like someone afraid of breaking something precious and fragile. He had been born premature, with complications that doctors described with difficult words and diagnoses that sounded like sentences. Irreversible blindness, paralysis in his lower limbs. A rare combination, the specialists said, as they flipped through exams and shook their heads with that expression that mixed pity and helplessness. Beatrice Ashford had been a vibrant woman. A dance teacher, she used to fill the house with music, twirling through the living room with a lightness that was contagious to anyone. Edward had fallen in love with precisely that, with the way she transformed the spaces she passed through. But since Gabriel was born, Beatrice had become a shadow. She no longer danced. She barely smiled. She spent her days between medical appointments, physical therapy sessions for her son, and a pharmaceutical routine that included sedatives, antidepressants, and sleeping pills. The house, which once breathed life, now felt like a silent hospital, with long hallways and overly organized rooms. Edward dealt with the pain the only way he knew how, by working. He left before dawn and returned when Gabriel was already asleep. He told himself he was building a secure future for his son, that every closed deal was another brick in the financial fortress that would protect Gabriel from any adversity. But deep down he knew the truth. Working was easier than looking at his son and feeling that suffocating mixture of love and helplessness. The afternoons at the Ashford Mansion were silent. Beatrice would sit beside Gabriel on the glass-enclosed porch overlooking the garden. She would describe what she saw, trying to paint the world with words. The flowers that bloomed, the birds that landed on the bird bath, the clouds that changed shape. Gabriel listened in silence, expressionless, as if those words were just meaningless sounds. He didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't ask for anything. He just existed, too quiet for a 7-year-old child. The specialists said it was important to stimulate Gabriel, to keep him connected to the world, even if he couldn't see it or explore it like other children. But Beatrice felt she was failing. Every word that left her mouth seemed hollow, insufficient. How do you describe the blue of the sky to someone who has never seen blue? How do you explain the movement of the trees in the wind to someone who has never run among them? It was on a Thursday afternoon in July, when the heat made the air heavy and the garden seemed to shimmer under the relentless sun, that everything began to change. Beatrice heard the doorbell ring. She wasn't expecting anyone. The housekeeper, Mrs. Celia, went to the gate and returned with a confused expression on her face. There was a boy there, she said, a boy who asked to speak with the family. He was barefoot, with mended clothes and a cloth bag in his hands. Beatrice was about to dismiss him, to tell Mrs. Celia to give him some money and food, as she always did with those who knocked on her door. But something in the housekeeper's description made her hesitate. The boy wasn't begging, he said he had come to help. He said he knew about Gabriel. Curious and slightly annoyed by the invasion of privacy, Beatrice decided to go to the gate. Gabriel was in his adapted stroller beside her, his face turned towards nothing, as always. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 years old. He was thin, with suntanned skin, tousled hair, and bright eyes that seemed to defy any adversity. He held the cloth bag with both hands, as if it were a treasure. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, with a politeness that contrasted with his ragged appearance. "My name is Matthew. I've come to help your son." Beatrice frowned. "Help? How do you know about my son?" "Everyone in Englewood knows," Matthew replied, referring to the poor neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, where he came from. "People talk. They say there's a boy here who can't see and can't walk. My grandmother said I should come." Beatrice felt a pang of anger. Her private life, her son's condition, had become gossip. But something in the boy's sincerity made her hold back her irritation. Matthew took a step forward, pointing to the bag. "I brought clay from the banks of the river where my grandmother lives. She said it's special clay, that it has healing power. My grandfather used it to heal everything: back pain, wounds that wouldn't close, even sadness. He healed with clay and with words." Beatrice almost laughed, but the laugh died in her throat. This was absurd. Clay? Healing with clay? The best doctors in the country had already examined Gabriel. Experimental treatments, alternative therapies, everything had been tried. And now a barefoot boy was showing up offering clay? "Look, Matthew," Beatrice began, trying to be gentle, "I appreciate the thought, but my son has already been examined by many doctors. It's not something that clay can solve." Matthew was unfazed. "I know doctors are important, ma'am, but sometimes healing doesn't just come from medicine. It comes from attention, from care, from presence. My grandmother always says that. She said I had to come, that I would be important to him." There was something in the boy's voice, a conviction so pure and devoid of malice, that broke down Beatrice's defenses. She looked at Gabriel, who remained motionless, oblivious to the conversation. She thought of all the empty afternoons, of all the silence that filled the house, of all the failed attempts to reach her son. "What exactly do you want to do?" she asked, more out of exhaustion than hope. "I want to put the clay on his legs and over his eyes, carefully. And while the clay dries, I'll tell him what the world is like. My grandmother said that's how it works. The clay draws out what's stuck in the body, and the words draw out what's stuck in the soul." Beatrice took a deep breath. This was crazy, but it was harmless crazy, and she was too tired to argue. Besides, a small, almost extinct part of her wanted to believe that there was still something that could be done. "All right," she said finally, "but if you hurt my son, if you do anything that bothers him, I'll stop this immediately. Understood?" Matthew smiled, a wide, genuine smile. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. I'll be very careful, I promise." They entered the house, and Matthew stopped in the foyer, looking around with wide eyes. He had never seen anything like it. The crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling, the marble floor, the paintings on the walls. Everything was big, clean, shiny. But it was also cold. There were no traces of life there, only of organization. Beatrice led Matthew and Gabriel to the porch. The afternoon's natural light flooded the space, and the garden stretched out greenly on the other side of the glass. Matthew knelt beside Gabriel, opening the cloth bag. The smell of wet earth filled the room. "Hi, Gabriel," Matthew said softly, moving closer. "I'm Matthew. I came here so we can be friends and to help you. Can I touch your leg?" Gabriel didn't answer, but he didn't pull back either. Beatrice watched everything attentively, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of discomfort. Matthew dipped his hands in the clay and began to apply it gently to Gabriel's thin legs. His movements were smooth, almost reverent. As he worked, he began to talk. "You know, Gabriel, the world out there is crazy. Today I came here and saw a bunch of stuff. There was a caramel-colored mutt sleeping on the sidewalk, all sprawled out, not a care in the world. He was snoring, you see. Then a lady with grocery bags walked by, and the dog didn't even care. But when a boy with bread passed, he shot up like a rocket. It's funny how animals know things." Beatrice noticed something strange. Gabriel had turned his face slightly in Matthew's direction. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. But it was there. Matthew continued, now applying the clay to Gabriel's closed eyes with even greater care. "And then there are the buses, bro. The Chicago City buses are insane. Everyone pushes, nobody waits for anyone to get off. But there's always one person who helps. Today, a lady held the door for me to get on even though the driver was already trying to leave. She smiled. You? No? One of those smiles that makes you believe the world isn't just a rush. For the first time in a long time, Beatrice saw something on Gabriel's face. It wasn't a smile, but there was a slight change in his expression, as if he were really paying attention. Matthew stayed there for almost an hour, describing everything in rich detail. The colors of the buildings, the noise of the traffic, the smell of food coming from open windows, the fights and laughter that echoed through the alleyways. He painted a world full of movement, of imperfections of real life. It wasn't the sterile, controlled world that Beatrice tried to describe. It was the raw, true, pulsating world. When the clay had dried completely, Matthew removed it carefully with a damp cloth. There you go, Gabriel. I'll be back tomorrow if your mum lets me. We'll do it again and I'll tell you more things. Did you like it? For the first time, Gabriel moved his lips. No sound came out, but he was trying to speak. Beatrice felt her eyes sting. It had been months since Gabriel had tried to communicate. Matthew stood up, putting the clay back in the bag. I'm heading out, ma'am, but I'll be back tomorrow, okay, if you want. Beatrice nodded, unable to speak. She walked Matthew to the gate, handed him some money for his return trip, but the boy refused. I don't want money, ma'am. I just want to help. My grandmother said that when you do something from the heart, you can't charge for it. He left, barefoot and light, disappearing down the tree-lined street as if he had never been there. Beatrice returned to the porch. Gabriel was exactly where she had left him, but something was different. He was smiling, a small, almost shy smile, but it was there. She knelt beside her son, holding his hand in hers. What is it, my love? Did you like Matthew? Gabriel nodded his head. A slight but affirmative movement. Beatrice hugged her son, and for the first time in a long time she felt something she had forgotten. Hope. When Edward arrived home that night, it was already past 10. The house was silent, as always. He dropped his briefcase in the hall and went straight up to the bedroom, expecting to find Beatrice already asleep, medicated and distant. But she was awake, sitting on the bed, her eyes red but bright. Edward, she said, and he noticed something different in her voice. Something happened today. He sat down beside her, concerned. What was it? A problem with Gabriel? No, it wasn't a problem. It was something strange but good. A boy showed up here today. A poor boy, barefoot, with a bag of clay. Edward frowned. Clay? Beatrice told him everything. Matthew's arrival, the ritual with the clay, the stories, Gabriel's reaction. Edward listened in silence, his expression shifting from disbelief to irritation. Beatrice, this is absurd. Clay, you let a stranger touch our son. What if he has some disease? What if it's a scam? I thought about that, she replied calmly. But Edward, you should have seen it. Gabriel reacted. He smiled. He tried to talk. That hasn't happened in months. Edward ran a hand over his face, tired. Beatrice, you're deluding yourself. This won't lead to anything. It's just another empty promise. You know what the doctors said. I know what the doctors said, she retorted, with a firmness he hadn't heard in a long time. But I also saw what happened today, and I'm going to let the boy come back, Edward sighed. Do what you think is best, but don't get your hopes up. When this comes to nothing, it will hurt even more. He stood up and went to take a shower, ending the conversation. But as the hot water fell on him, Edward couldn't get the image Beatrice had described out of his head. Gabriel smiling. It had been so long since he had seen his son smile. Matthew returned the next day, and the next, and the next, always in the middle of the afternoon, always with his bag of clay, always with new stories. He talked about street soccer, about the kites he flew with his cousins, about the music his neighbors played loudly on Sundays. He talked about his grandmother, Mrs. Rose, who washed clothes late at night to make a living. He talked about how her hands were calloused, but her hug could heal anything, and Gabriel day after day began to change. He smiled more. He started asking questions, his voice still weak, but present. What color is the sky? What does the river sound like? What does it feel like to have rain on your face, Matthew? Answered everything with infinite patience. He would take Gabriel's hand and place it on his own chest as he spoke, so Gabriel could feel the vibrations of his voice. He brought things from outside, small objects Gabriel could touch, a dry leaf, a smooth stone, a piece of cloth that smelled like coffee. Beatrice watched everything with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. She began to participate in the sessions, sitting nearby, listening to Matthew's stories, and watching her son slowly awaken. She stopped taking the sedatives during the day, wanting to be truly present. The fog that had enveloped. Her mind began to dissipate. Edward, on the other hand, remained skeptical. He came home late, avoided talking about Matthew, and answered with monosyllables when Beatrice tried to share the small victories. But deep down, a part of him began to feel something strange. Jealousy, guilt. He wasn't sure. It was on a Friday, 2 weeks after Matthew's arrival, that Edward came home early. He had cancelled a meeting due to an unforeseen event and decided to return before dark. As he entered, he heard voices coming from the porch. He approached silently and stood at the entrance, observing. Matthew was sitting on the floor next to Gabriel's chair, gesturing excitedly as he told a story about a cat that had gotten lost and was adopted by a bakery. Gabriel was laughing, really laughing, with his head thrown back, with sound, with joy. Edward felt something break inside him. When was the last time he had made his son laugh? When was the last time he had truly been present? He backed away, went up to his room, and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling. The empire he had built, all the hours stolen from his family, all the sacrifices he claimed to make for them. What good were they if a poor boy with a bag of clay and simple stories could achieve in 2 weeks what he hadn't managed in 7 years? That night, during dinner, Edward asked a question. "How was your day?" Beatrice and Gabriel looked up, surprised. It had been so long since Edward had asked. "It was good," Beatrice answered cautiously. "Matthew came again. He brought a new story today." Edward looked at Gabriel. "And did you like the story?" Gabriel nodded, smiling. "Yes, Dad. He told one about a cat." Edward swallowed hard. "That's good, son, that's good." They ate in silence for a few minutes, but it was a different silence. It was no longer the weight of emptiness. It was the quietness of people trying to rebuild something delicate. After dinner, Edward went up to Gabriel's room to help him get to sleep, something he hadn't done in months. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding his son's small hand. "Gabriel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not being here more often." Gabriel squeezed his hand. "It's okay, Dad. You work a lot." "That's no excuse," Edward whispered. "Nothing justifies me leaving you and your mother alone." They stayed there in silence until Gabriel fell asleep. And for the first time in years, Edward left the room with tears in his eyes, knowing that something fundamental needed to change. Meanwhile, in Englewood, on the other side of the city, Matthew entered the shack where he lived with his grandmother. Mrs. Rose was in the tiny kitchen, preparing rice and beans on an old stove. "So, my grandson, how was today?" Matthew smiled. "It was good, Grandma. Gabriel is getting better. He laughs now. He tells me stories, too." Mrs. Rose hugged her grandson. "I knew you would be important to him, my boy. You have your grandfather's gift, the gift of being present." Matthew didn't fully understand what his grandmother meant, but he felt he was doing something right, something that went beyond the clay, beyond the words, something that had to do with connection, with humanity, with the courage to show up when no one else did. And so, without knowing it, that barefoot boy and that family, surrounded by luxury, began to build a bridge over the chasm that separated them. A fragile bridge still, but a real one. A bridge made of clay, stories, and presence. A bridge that was just beginning to take hold, but that was already changing everything. The following weeks brought a routine the Ashford house hadn't known in years. Every day, around 3 in the afternoon, the doorbell would ring, and Matthew would appear with his bag of clay, his wide smile, and his seemingly endless stories. Mrs. Celia already left the gate ajar, knowing he would arrive. Beatrice prepared a hearty snack, trying to compensate for the thinness of the boy who refused any payment but accepted food with sincere gratitude. Gabriel waited for that moment like someone waiting for air. He would wake up earlier, ask his mother to dress him in his favorite clothes, and would be anxious until he heard Matthew's barefoot steps down the marble hallway. Every day his voice grew stronger. He began to tell stories too, to talk about the dreams he had at night, about the songs he heard on the radio, about the questions he kept in his head. Matthew listened to everything with genuine attention. He never rushed Gabriel, never interrupted him. He applied the clay with the same care as always, but now the two of them talked throughout the process. They laughed together. Sometimes they were silent, just sharing each other's presence, and it was a comfortable silence, different from the one that had previously inhabited the house. Beatrice felt as if she were waking from a deep sleep. She began to take care of herself again. She stopped taking sleeping pills, even if it meant restless nights. She found a therapist, a woman named Dr. Helen, who saw her twice a week in a cozy office in Wicker Park. In the sessions, Beatrice cried rivers, unearthed old wounds, and recognized how much she had lost herself in the role of a mother to a child with disabilities. "I feel guilty," she confessed to the therapist on a rainy afternoon. "Guilty for not being able to save him. Guilty for sometimes feeling angry at him, angry at the situation, angry at myself." Dr. Helen looked at her with empathy. "And now? How do you feel now?" "Hopeful, but afraid that this hope will be snatched away from me again. Hope is not a promise of a cure. Beatrice, it's permission to live while you search. You are rediscovering your son. That is already a victory." Beatrice left that session with something she hadn't felt in years. Lightness. Edward, for his part, began to come home earlier. Not every day, but with a frequency that surprised even himself. He delegated more, refused commitments he once considered non-negotiable, and spent entire Friday afternoons at home. At first, he stayed in his office, working remotely. But gradually he began to come downstairs to appear on the porch where Matthew and Gabriel were. Matthew would greet him naturally. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ashford. Want to hear today's story?" Edward found himself accepting, sitting in a nearby chair, pretending to check emails on his phone, but actually paying attention to every word. Matthew had a special way of telling stories. He didn't embellish too much, didn't force emotion. He just narrated life as it was, with its contradictions and imperfect beauties. One day, Matthew was telling a story about a street soccer game, about how the boys fought over a bad call, but later made up and shared a bag of popcorn. Edward caught himself smiling. When was the last time he had played soccer? When was the last time he had allowed himself to be just a person, without the armor of a successful businessman? "Mr. Ashford," Matthew called out suddenly, "do you play soccer?" Edward blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. "Me? Oh, I used to when I was younger, a long time ago." "Then you have to play again. Soccer is good for the soul." Gabriel laughed. "I wish I could play soccer, Matthew." "One day you will, bro. I'll teach you. We'll figure something out." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. That boy who had nothing offered his son something that all the doctors and expensive therapies had failed to provide. A future, possibility, dreams. It was on a December afternoon, when the cold was biting and the garden looked stark under the pale sun, that things started to get complicated. Matthew arrived later than usual, and for the first time Beatrice noticed something different about him. He was tense, his smile forced, his eyes restless. "Is everything okay, Matthew?" she asked as he knelt beside Gabriel. "Everything's fine, Mom, just a busy day." He applied the clay as always, but his hands trembled slightly. Gabriel noticed too. "Matthew, are you scared?" Matthew hesitated. "It's not fear, no, it's just, my dad showed up yesterday. I hadn't seen him in a long time." Beatrice moved closer, sitting beside them. "Your father? You don't live with him?" "No, ma'am. I live just with my grandmother. My dad left when I was little. He shows up every now and then, asks my grandma for money, makes a mess, and disappears again." "And yesterday? What happened yesterday?" Matthew swallowed hard. He asked where I was going every day. My grandma didn't want to tell him, but he found out. He said that if I'm coming here to this big house, it's because you all have a lot of money, and that I'm an idiot for coming for free. Beatrice felt a wave of anger. But you're not coming for free. You're doing something precious for my son. I know, ma'am, but my dad doesn't understand. He said he's going to come here, that he's going to talk to you. Gabriel held Matthew's hand. Don't let him take you away, Matthew. I need you here. Matthew smiled, squeezing his friend's hand. I'm not going anywhere, bro, I promise. But the promise sounded fragile, and Beatrice knew trouble was on the way. The next morning, a Saturday, Edward was on the porch reading the newspaper when Mrs. Celia came to tell him there was a man at the gate asking to speak with him. Edward went down and found a middle-aged man, thin and with hard eyes. He smelled of cheap whiskey and cigarettes, and had an aggressive posture barely disguised by a crooked smile. Good morning. Are you the owner of the house? I am. Can I help you? You can. My name is Ronald. I'm Matthew's father, the boy who comes here every day. Edward crossed his arms. Yes, and I heard my son is providing a service here. He's healing your son with my mother's clay, and healing isn't free, sir. Edward felt his jaw tighten. Matthew isn't charging anything. He comes because he wants to. Ronald took an aggressive step forward. He's a kid. He doesn't know what he's doing. But I do, and I know people like you have money to spare, so I'll be direct. I want $10,000. If not, I'll forbid my son from coming here. Edward was not a man to back down from threats. He had built an empire facing people far more dangerous than this man, but something about the situation made him hesitate. This was Matthew's father, and Matthew was important to Gabriel. A wrong move here could be costly. I'm not going to give you money, Edward said firmly, but I can offer you something else. If you need a job, I can arrange something at my company. If you need help, we can talk. But extortion, no. Ronald laughed, a harsh laugh. A job? I didn't come here to ask for charity. I came to collect what's fair. My son, my clay, my healing. $10,000 or he doesn't come back. Edward took a step forward, getting face to face with Ronald. You have no authority over what your son does. If he wants to come here, he will continue to come. And if you try to stop him, I will call Child Protective Services and ensure his grandmother gets official custody of him. Ronald narrowed his eyes. Be careful, mister. You don't know who you're messing with. And you don't know who you're trying to extort. Now get off my property before I call the police. Ronald spat on the ground, turned his back and walked away, but not before shouting, This isn't over. Edward went back inside the house, his heart racing. He knew he had done the right thing, but he also knew this wasn't finished. That afternoon, Matthew didn't show up, nor the next day. Gabriel was inconsolable. He called for his friend, asked where he was, if he had done something wrong. Beatrice tried to calm him, but she was worried herself. Edward decided to go to Englewood. He got in his car and drove to the south side, following the address Matthew had once given him. The streets were narrow, unpaved in some sections, with houses crammed together. He stopped in front of a wooden shack with a clothesline full of laundry out front. An elderly woman was hanging up sheets. She was small, with wrinkled skin and calloused hands, but her eyes held an unshakable strength. Seeing Edward, she stopped what she was doing. You're Gabriel's father? Edward blinked, surprised. I am. And you are Matthew's grandmother? I am. Mrs. Rose, please come in. She led him inside the shack. It was tiny but impeccably clean. Matthew was sitting on a mattress on the floor, his eyes red. Matthew, Edward said softly, Gabriel is waiting for you. Matthew looked at his grandmother, who nodded. Go on, my boy. Your father doesn't control you. But Grandma, what if he comes back? Mrs. Rose knelt beside her grandson, holding his face in her hands. I've faced worse in my life, Matthew. An ungrateful son isn't going to scare me. You will keep going to Gabriel's house because that's where you're supposed to be, and I will protect you as I always have. Edward felt a lump in his throat. Mrs. Rose, if you'll allow me, I'd like to offer a solution. You and Matthew can come live at my house. We have plenty of space. He would be closer to Gabriel, and you would be safe." Mrs. Rose stared at him, sizing him up. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity, it's a fair exchange. Matthew is helping my son in a way no one else could. It's the least I can do." Mrs. Rose thought for a long moment. "All right, but I work. I won't sit around. You can work if you want, or you can rest. The choice is yours." And so Mrs. Rose and Matthew went to live with the Ashfords. Edward had a small but comfortable guest cottage prepared for them at the back of the property, where they could maintain their privacy. The integration was strange at first. Mrs. Rose wasn't used to so much comfort and felt out of place, but gradually she began to become part of that house in a unique way. She would wake up early and prepare breakfast for everyone with that simple, delicious touch that turned any food into affection. She told stories about Matthew's grandfather, about the old days, about the wisdom that came from the earth and the hands. Beatrice found herself sitting in the kitchen with her, listening to those stories, learning about herbs, teas, and cures that didn't come from pharmacies. One afternoon, Mrs. Rose looked at Beatrice and said something that was etched in her memory forever. "You don't need medicine to sleep, you need peace. And peace is something we build, not something we buy." Beatrice cried. For the first time, someone had seen through her without judgment. And there a process of deconstruction began. She gradually stopped taking the antidepressants with medical guidance and replaced chemical dependency with intensive therapy, meditation, and long conversations with Mrs. Rose on the porch. Gabriel and Matthew became inseparable. They spent their days together, creating imaginary worlds, inventing adapted games, laughing at things only they understood. Matthew started attending a private school on a full scholarship arranged by Edward. He was smart, learned quickly, and for the first time had the resources to explore his full potential. Edward, in turn, began to rediscover who he was beyond the businessman. He started having lunch at home, participating in dinners, and having real conversations with his wife and son. But not. Everything was easy. His partners complained about his absence. Important contracts were being lost because he wasn't available. The business press began to speculate whether Edward Ashford was losing his focus. One day, he received a call from Marcus, his oldest partner. "Edward, we need to talk. There's a $15 million contract on the table, but the client wants to close with you in person. It's on Saturday, Gabriel's birthday. I know it's complicated, but it's a lot of money at stake." Edward looked out his office window, seeing Gabriel and Matthew playing in the garden. Gabriel's birthday. He had never been present for any of them. He always had an excuse, an urgent deal, an unavoidable trip. "Marcus, I'm not going." "What do you mean you're not going?" "Edward, it's $15 million. "I know, but it's my son's birthday." There was a silence on the other end of the line. "Are you okay? Since when do you choose a birthday over a deal?" "Since I realized that no deal is worth my son's childhood. Go without me. Close the contract or don't, but I'll be at the birthday party." "Edward, if you don't go, the client will back out, and I'll have to rethink our partnership." "Then rethink it. Do what you think is best." Edward hung up and took a deep breath. He had just made a choice that could cost him millions. But for the first time in his life, he felt he had made the right choice. On Saturday, the house was decorated with balloons and colorful banners. Beatrice had prepared everything with the help of Mrs. Rose, who made a homemade chocolate cake that smelled like childhood. Gabriel was radiant, dressed in his favorite soccer team's jersey, surrounded by a few friends from therapy and, of course, Matthew. Edward arrived with a huge gift, an adapted bicycle with 3 wheels and special support. Gabriel couldn't pedal on his own yet, but Edward could push him, and they could ride together through the garden. "Dad," Gabriel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You came." "I came, son, and I'll be at all the next ones." They spent the entire afternoon together. Edward pushed Gabriel all over the property on the new bicycle. They laughed, talked, and ate cake until they were sick. And when night fell and everyone had gone home, Edward sat with his son on his lap, something he hadn't done since Gabriel was a baby. "I love you, Gabriel. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it right." Gabriel hugged his father. "I love you too, Dad. And it's okay. You're here now." And in that moment, Edward understood something fundamental. He had spent years building an empire to secure his son's future. But what Gabriel really needed wasn't financial security. It was presence. It was a father. Meanwhile, in a dirty bar on the other side of the city, Ronald drank alone, stewing in anger. He had lost control over his son, over his mother, and hadn't gotten a cent from those rich people. But this wasn't over. He was already plotting something that would make them pay, something that would make them understand he wasn't someone to be ignored with impunity. And so, while the Ashford house breathed happiness and reconstruction, a silent storm was forming on the horizon, a storm that was about to test just how far that family could go to protect what they had built. The following months were a period of peace the Ashford family hadn't known. The house, once a silent mausoleum of contained pain, had transformed into a home. Gabriel made slow but steady progress. He began to move his toes during sessions with Matthew, small tremors that left everyone emotional. It was still nothing that medicine could explain, but it was happening. Beatrice was a different person. She started dancing again alone in the living room, with timid movements at first that gradually regained their former fluidity. Mrs. Rose would often watch from the kitchen, smiling with motherly pride, as if Beatrice were her daughter too. The two had developed a deep friendship, one that transcended social classes and was based solely on true respect and affection. Edward was transformed. He had completely restructured his routine. He woke up early to have breakfast with the family, had lunch at home at least 3 times a week, and reserved Friday afternoons exclusively for Gabriel. His partners complained, some clients pulled away, but Edward discovered something surprising. The company didn't collapse without him. In fact, by delegating more and trusting his team, the business continued to thrive, just in a different way. But not everything was perfect. Ronald hadn't completely disappeared. He would show up occasionally around the property, always drunk, always shouting threats. Mrs. Rose remained calm, but Matthew tensed up whenever he heard about his father. Edward had hired discreet security and engaged lawyers to ensure Mrs. Rose had legal custody of Matthew, but the legal processes were slow. It was on a March afternoon, as autumn began to cool the Chicago air, that something extraordinary happened. Matthew was applying the clay to Gabriel, as always, when Gabriel grabbed his friend's wrist. "Matthew, I saw something." Matthew froze. "What do you mean you saw?" "It was quick, like a flash. A light, I think." Beatrice, who was nearby, approached quickly. "Gabriel, are you sure?" Gabriel was trembling, his eyes closed, trying to process what had happened. "I think so, Mum. I can't explain it. It was like something lit up inside my head." Edward was called immediately. He cancelled a meeting and arrived home in record time. Together they decided to take Gabriel for a new round of tests, but this time they wouldn't go to the usual doctors. Edward had heard of a brilliant neurologist, Dr. Camilla Hayes, who worked with complex cases and had a different, more holistic and investigative approach. The appointment was scheduled for the following week. Dr. Hayes received the family in a spacious and welcoming office with plants and natural light. She was a middle-aged woman, with graying hair tied in a bun and penetrating eyes that seemed to see beyond the obvious. She listened to the entire story, from Gabriel's birth, through the diagnoses to Matthew's arrival and the recent progress. She didn't interrupt, just made occasional notes and nodded her head. When they finished, Dr. Hayes was silent for a long moment, thoughtful. "I'd like to run some different tests," she said finally. "Not the conventional ones. I want to do MRIs, focusing on specific areas of the brain, analyses of responses to emotional stimuli, and a deep psychological evaluation." "But the doctors already said it's irreversible," Beatrice argued, afraid of creating false hope. "The doctors said what the tests showed. But sometimes the tests don't show everything. The human body is complex, and the brain even more so. There are rare cases, very rare, where what appears to be a physical injury is actually a psychological response to a deep trauma." Edward leaned forward. "Are you saying Gabriel's blindness and paralysis could be psychological?" "I'm saying we need to investigate all possibilities. I'm not promising anything. But we are going to explore paths that may not have been explored before. The tests began. Gabriel underwent detailed magnetic resonance imaging, neurological response tests, and sessions with psychologists specializing in childhood trauma. It was an exhaustive and sometimes painful process. Gabriel would cry, get tired, and more than once wanted to give up. But Matthew was always by his side, holding his friend's hand, telling stories to distract him during the long procedures. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes began conducting separate interviews with Edward and Beatrice. She wanted to understand the family dynamics, the events surrounding Gabriel's birth, anything that could provide clues. It was during one of these interviews that Edward mentioned something he hadn't given much importance to before. "Do you remember any specific event, any striking moment when Gabriel was very young?" Dr. Hayes asked. Edward thought for a long time. "There was one day," he began, his voice hesitant. "Gabriel must have been about 2. I had a terrible day at work. An investor had tricked me. I lost a lot of money. I came home furious. Beatrice tried to talk to me, but I exploded. I yelled, I broke her face. I said horrible things. Gabriel was there. He saw everything." Dr. Hayes noted everything, expressionless. "And after that day, did you notice any change in Gabriel?" Edward closed his eyes, forcing his memory. "Now that you mention it, yes. He became quieter, stopped playing as much. And it was around that time that the first signs of his motor and visual difficulties began." The doctor nodded, but didn't reveal her conclusions yet. She needed more data. Beatrice was interviewed separately. She told about the difficult pregnancy, the premature birth, the panic she felt when the doctors said there were complications. But when Dr. Hayes asked about traumatic events after the birth, Beatrice also mentioned that day, the day Edward had exploded with rage. "I was terrified," Beatrice confessed, tears in her eyes. "I had never seen Edward like that. He was out of control. I picked Gabriel up and ran to the bedroom. I locked the door, and Gabriel cried all night. He cried in a way I had never heard before, as if something inside him had broken." Dr. Hayes pieced together all the information, and 3 weeks later called the family for a meeting. They sat in the consultation room, tense, awaiting the verdict. "I have analyzed all the tests," Dr. Hayes began, "and I found something interesting. The most recent MRIs show no significant structural damage to Gabriel's optic nerves. The structures are intact. The same goes for the motor functions related to his legs. There is no physical damage that justifies the complete paralysis." Beatrice held Edward's hand, not understanding. "But then why can't he see? Why can't he walk?" "Because his brain decided it wasn't safe." Edward frowned. "What does that mean?" Dr. Hayes leaned forward, choosing her words carefully. "Gabriel is suffering from what we call psychogenic blindness and paralysis. It's a rare but real condition where a deep psychological trauma causes physical symptoms. The brain, as a defense mechanism, blocks certain functions to protect the person from reliving the pain. In Gabriel's case, I believe he witnessed something so frightening, so overwhelming, that his brain decided to shut the doors of sight and movement to avoid having to process that terror again." Edward felt the world spin. "Are you saying I did this to my son?" "You didn't do it intentionally," Dr. Hayes said firmly. "You didn't know. And Gabriel was too young to process what was happening. But yes, the trauma he suffered that day, seeing your uncontrolled anger, feeling his mother's fear, experiencing that rupture in the safety of his home, was the trigger." Edward broke down. He put his face in his hands and cried as he had never cried in his life. Beatrice, though in shock, hugged her husband, sharing the pain. "But there is hope," Dr. Hayes continued, her voice gentle. "If the cause is psychological, then the cure can also come from that path. Gabriel needs to feel safe again. He needs to rebuild the trust that the world is not a threatening place. And apparently Matthew has been doing exactly that." "The boy with the clay," Beatrice whispered. "Exactly. Matthew, without knowing it, has been the most effective therapist Gabriel could have had. He brought presence, he brought safety, he brought a narrative world that doesn't threaten Gabriel. And slowly, Gabriel's brain is understanding that it's safe to come back. That's why the flashes of light, the movements in his toes, they are signs that his mind is allowing the return, "What do we need to do?" Edward asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Continue. Doing what you're doing. Gabriel needs a safe, loving, predictable environment. He needs you to be present not just physically, but emotionally. And Edward, you need to work on this. You need to process your own guilt, ask Gabriel for forgiveness, and show him that you've changed." Edward nodded, determined. "I'll do whatever it takes." In the following days, Edward began intensive therapy. He delved deep into his own wounds, his insecurities, all the destructive patterns he had carried for years. He discovered that his anger came from his own father, a harsh and critical man who had never shown affection. Edward had spent his life trying to prove his worth, and when the world challenged him, he would explode. But now, he had a chance to break that cycle, and he was determined to do it. One afternoon, he asked to be alone with Gabriel. Matthew and Beatrice left, leaving father and son on the porch. Edward knelt beside Gabriel's chair, holding the boy's small hands. "Gabriel, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to me until the end." Gabriel turned his face toward his father's voice, attentive. "When you were very little, I did something terrible. I yelled, I broke things, I scared you and your mother. I was angry, but not at you. I was angry at myself. And I didn't know, I didn't understand. But it hurt you in a deep way. And because of that, your body decided to protect itself. It decided to close you off from the world." Gabriel was silent, processing. Edward took a deep breath, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, son. More sorry than any words can say. I spent years running, working, trying to fix things with money. But what you needed was me, your dad. And I wasn't here, but I'm here now, and I always will be. I've changed, Gabriel, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life showing you that." Gabriel reached out his hand and touched his father's face, feeling the tears. "Dad, I forgive you." Those 4 words were like a dam breaking. Edward hugged his son, and the two cried together, releasing years of pain, fear, and silence. It was a moment of pure catharsis, of emotional purification. And then something extraordinary happened. Gabriel blinked, and for the first time in 5 years he saw a shape, blurry, indistinct, but there. "Dad," he whispered, "I'm seeing you, I'm seeing." Edward froze. "What?" "It's not clear. It's all blurry, but I see a shadow. Is it you?" Edward held his son's face, his eyes wide. "Yes, son, it's me. You're seeing me." They stayed there embraced, laughing and crying at the same time. Beatrice, who had returned and was watching from the door, ran to join them, and the 3 of them hugged, forming a circle of love and reconstruction. Matthew, hearing the commotion, also ran to the porch, and when he saw Gabriel smiling, with his eyes open and looking in Edward's direction, he knew the healing hadn't come from the clay, it had come from forgiveness. In the days that followed, Gabriel continued to make progress. His vision returned slowly, still hazy, but improving day by day. He began to move his legs with more strength, to contract his muscles, to respond to stimuli. The doctors were astonished. Dr. Hayes monitored everything closely, documenting every advance. But while the family celebrated, Ronald watched from a distance, his anger growing. He had lost his son, lost control, and now he saw that happy, united, prosperous family. And he was alone, sunk in alcohol and resentment. One night he showed up drunk at the gate, shouting and kicking it. The security guards restrained him, but he yelled for Mrs. Rose to hear. "Your mother is a traitor. You abandoned me, Mom, because of them?" Mrs. Rose came out of the house with Matthew trying to hold her back. She walked to the gate, facing her son with a dignity that cut like a blade. "Ronald, I never abandoned you. You abandoned yourself. You chose drink, you chose anger, you chose violence, and I won't let you destroy my grandson like you tried to destroy me." Ronald took a step back, as if he had been punched. His mother had never spoken to him that way. "I forgive you, son, but I won't allow you to cause any more pain. If you want to change, the doors are open. But if you come to destroy, the doors will be closed." Ronald stood there, wavering between anger and something that looked like pain. Then, without a word, he turned his back and disappeared into the night. Mrs. Rose returned to the house, trembling. Beatrice hugged her, and the two women stood there crying, but also feeling a sense of relief. Some cycles need to be broken for new ones to begin. Gabriel continued to improve. His vision gradually returned, and he began to walk with the help of walkers, then crutches. Every step was a victory, every clear image a miracle. The house was in constant celebration, and Matthew, the boy who had brought the clay and the hope, remained by his friend's side, now not as a healer, but as a brother. They had created something that went beyond any ritual, beyond any diagnosis. They had created a bond that time and distance could never break. Their story was just beginning, and the most beautiful chapter was yet to come. 2 years had passed since that transformative day on the porch. Gabriel was now 9 years old and walked with crutches, balancing with a confidence that grew each day. His vision had returned almost completely, still with some peripheral limitations, but he could see the faces of the people he loved. He could see the colors of the garden. He could see the world that Matthew had painted with words for so long. And reality was even more beautiful than he had imagined. The Ashford house had transformed into something that transcended material wealth. It was a space of true life, where laughter echoed through the hallways, where deep conversations happened at the dinner table, where each person felt seen and loved. Edward had found a balance between work and family. He had delegated much of the operational management to trusted partners, and now focused on projects he was truly passionate about, including social initiatives he never imagined developing. Beatrice had written a book. She hadn't planned to, but Dr. Hayes encouraged her to document the family's journey. The result was a touching work called The Clay and the Soul, which chronicled the story of a family destroyed by trauma and rebuilt by forgiveness and presence. The book became a national phenomenon, touching thousands of families living in similar situations. Beatrice began giving talks, becoming an important voice in the conversation about children's mental health and psychological trauma. Mrs. Rose continued to live in the guest cottage, but now spent most of her time in the main house. She had become the de facto matriarch of this extended family. Her stories, her wisdom, her quiet affection were the cement that held everyone together. She had taught Beatrice to cook simple dishes, had taught Edward to value contemplative silence, and continued to be Matthew's safe harbor. Matthew, now 11, was a different boy. He was studying at one of Chicago's best schools, getting excellent grades, and dreamed of becoming a doctor. But not just any doctor. He wanted to be a neurologist, like Dr. Hayes, so he could help other children like Gabriel. He and Gabriel were inseparable, and their friendship had transformed into a true brotherhood. It was Matthew who had the idea for the project. He and Gabriel were in the garden talking about the future, when Matthew said something that would change everything. "Bro, we should do something to help other kids. There are a lot of people who go through what you went through, but they don't have someone like Dr. Hayes, someone who really investigates." Gabriel, now able to express his ideas clearly, agreed immediately. We could create a space, a place where children with disabilities could receive real care, not just medical but emotional too. They took the idea to Edward and Beatrice, who were thrilled. Edward saw it as a way to give real purpose to the fortune he had accumulated. Beatrice saw it as a way to multiply the healing her family had experienced. And so, the Presence Project was born. The Presence Project was ambitious. It would be a multidisciplinary center for children with physical and emotional disabilities, offering cutting-edge medical treatment combined with psychological support, occupational therapy, art therapy, and a fundamental component: human presence. Inspired by Matthew and Gabriel's experience, the center would hire mentors, people of different ages and backgrounds, to develop genuine bonds with the children they served. Edward invested heavily. He bought a large plot of land on the south side of Chicago, hired the best architects to create an accessible and welcoming space, and assembled a team of professionals who shared the same vision. Dr. Hayes agreed to be the project's medical director. Beatrice took on the coordination of family relations, working directly with parents and guardians. The construction took a year. During that time, Gabriel and Matthew were involved in everything. They gave opinions on the design, tested the accessibility, and helped select the professionals through interviews. They wanted to ensure that every person who became part of the project understood that it wasn't about charity or pity, but about dignity and connection. On opening day, a large crowd attended, families of children with disabilities, health professionals, politicians, journalists, and even celebrities who had been moved by the story told in Beatrice's book. The center was beautiful with gentle ramps, sensory gardens, colorful rooms, and wide-open spaces where children could move freely. Gabriel, leaning on his crutches, took the makeshift stage with Matthew. The two boys, who had started this journey with a bag of clay and a simple belief, were now there to inaugurate something that would change hundreds of lives. Gabriel took the microphone first. He spoke with a clarity that impressed everyone. "I spent 5 years without seeing, without walking. The doctors said it was irreversible. But what they didn't know was that my body wasn't sick. My soul was. And the cure didn't come from medicine, it came from love. It came from my friend Matthew, who showed up when no one else knew what to do. It came from my father, who learned to ask for forgiveness. It came from my mother, who found strength where she thought she had none left. And it came from Mrs. Rose, who taught us that healing is presence." Matthew took the microphone next, more shy but firm. "I didn't know I was healing anyone. I just wanted to be a friend. My grandmother always said that everyone needs someone to show up, someone to stay. And that's what this place is, a place where we show up, where we stay. It doesn't matter how long it takes. It doesn't matter if the healing is fast or slow. What matters is that no one is left alone." The audience rose to a standing ovation. Many were crying. Edward, standing beside Beatrice, held his wife's hand tightly, his eyes glistening. He had built buildings, companies, fortunes, but nothing compared to building this. The center opened its doors the following week. The first families arrived scared, hopeful, exhausted. Each child was received with care, evaluated by Dr. Hayes and her team, and then integrated into a personalized treatment plan. But the real difference was the mentors. Young people, adults, and seniors who volunteered a few hours a week to be with these children, to talk, to play, to listen. Gabriel and Matthew, despite their youth, became mentors too. They had a special connection with the children who arrived because they knew exactly what it was like to be there. Gabriel, with his crutches and his still recovering vision, was living proof that the journey was worth it. And Matthew, with his resilient joy and endless stories, was a reminder that hope could come from the most unexpected places. The months passed and the stories of transformation multiplied. A girl who hadn't spoken in 3 years began to whisper stories after 6 months of mentorship. A boy with cerebral palsy, whom everyone said would never walk, took his first steps supported by a mentor who insisted day after day that he was capable. A teenager with deep depression found the courage at the center to keep living. Beatrice documented everything. Each story became material for new articles, talks, and even a second book. Edward, for his part, began to use his business influence to replicate the model. He contacted other entrepreneurs, convincing them to invest in similar centers in other cities. The Presence Project began to expand, but not everything was perfect. Ronald, Matthew's father, remained a distant shadow. He never showed up to cause trouble again, but he also never accepted Mrs. Rose's invitations to get treatment and reconcile. Matthew carried that silent pain, the pain of having a living but absent father. Mrs. Rose tried to fill that void with her unconditional love, but she knew there were wounds that only time and Ronald himself could heal. One afternoon, 3 years after the center's inauguration, Ronald appeared. Not drunk, not aggressive. He was sober, thin, aged, but with clear eyes. He asked to speak with Mrs. Rose, who received him in the cottage with Matthew by her side. "Mom," Ronald began, his voice thick with emotion, "I know I don't even deserve to be here. I know how much I made you suffer. But I did it. I've been clean for a year. I'm in treatment. I go to meetings. I have an honest job." Mrs. Rose said nothing, just waited. Ronald looked at Matthew, who stared back with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Matthew, I don't expect you to forgive me. I wasn't a father. I abandoned you. I abandoned your grandmother, and I even had the nerve to try to ruin the only good place you had. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I understand if you never want to see me again." Matthew took a deep breath. He had waited years for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he didn't know what to feel. Forgiving wasn't forgetting, he had learned that from Mrs. Rose, but it also wasn't carrying the weight of anger forever. "I don't know if we can have a relationship, Dad. You hurt me a lot, but I'm glad you're taking care of yourself, and if you keep it up, clean and honest, maybe one day we can try." Ronald nodded, tears streaming down his face. "It's more than I deserve," Mrs. Rose finally spoke, her voice firm but loving. "Ronald, the doors of my house have always been open for the son I knew, not for the man the drink made you. If you've come back to be that man again, then you are welcome, but only you." Ronald promised he would return, not to live, but to build a true presence in his son's life, and for the first time, Matthew believed it might be possible. The following years were ones of consolidation. Gabriel, now 12, walked without crutches most of the time. He used a light, cane only for long walks. His vision was almost perfect, with just a slight astigmatism that glasses easily corrected. He was a boy full of life, passionate about music and adapted soccer, and had a large group of friends. Matthew was in his first year of high school, a scholarship student at an elite school. He was the top student in his class, but never let success distance him from his roots. He continued to visit Inglewood every weekend, visiting neighbors, playing soccer with the street kids, always remembering where he came from. Edward had almost completely stepped away from the operational management of his companies. He dedicated most of his time to the Presence Project, which now had 5 units across the country and plans for international expansion. He also became a sought-after speaker, talking about compassionate leadership and the importance of presence in corporate and family life. Beatrice released her 3rd book. This one focused on how communities can unite to support families in crisis. She traveled the country giving workshops, training professionals, and always carrying the message that healing is collective, never individual. Mrs. Rose, now 75, continued to be everyone's emotional anchor. She didn't fully understand how that small decision to send her grandson with a bag of clay had turned into all this, but she knew there was something greater at work, something she called purpose. It was on a sunny Saturday in November, 10 years after Matthew's first visit to the Ashford house, that everyone gathered in the garden for a special celebration. Gabriel was turning 12 and Matthew 14. But it wasn't just a birthday party, it was a symbolic ceremony. Edward brought out the original cloth bag, the one Matthew had carried that first time. It was empty, kept as a relic. He placed it in the center of a decorated table, and everyone gathered around. Gabriel, leaning on Edward, spoke. "This bag of clay changed my life, but it wasn't the clay that healed me. It was what came with it. It was the courage of a boy who believed he could make a difference. It was my father's forgiveness. It was my mother's strength. It was Mrs. Rose's wisdom. It was the human connection we created." Matthew added, "And now we want to pass it on." We filled another bag of clay, a symbolic one that will stay at the center of the Presence Project, to remind everyone that healing isn't magic, it's presence, it's persistence, it's love. They unveiled the new bag, filled with fresh clay from the riverbank where Mrs. Rose grew up, and inside they placed small symbolic objects, a letter written by each family member, photos of the most important moments of their journey, and a promise, signed by all, that they would continue to show up, to stay, to love. The party continued with music, dancing, and food. Edward and Beatrice danced together for the first time in over a decade, laughing like teenagers. Gabriel and Matthew ran through the garden playing tag, with Gabriel showing everyone that he could run, even if a little slower. Mrs. Rose watched from a distance with a peaceful smile, knowing her mission was complete. At night, when everyone had gone home and the house had returned to its welcoming silence, Edward went up to Gabriel's room for their usual ritual. "Good night, son." Gabriel, already in bed, smiled. "Good night, Dad. Thanks for being here." "Always," Edward replied, kissing his son's forehead. "Dad," Gabriel called as Edward was almost at the door, "what do you think will happen from now on?" Edward came back, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I think we'll keep growing. You, me, our family, the project, and we'll keep helping other people find what we found." "And what's that?" Edward thought for a moment. It's the certainty that it's never too late to start over, that love can heal what medicine can't reach, and that the greatest wealth isn't what we have, but who we become when we choose to be present. Gabriel nodded, closing his eyes. I like that. Edward left the room with a full heart. He looked out the window and saw Matthew and Mrs. Rose walking through the garden, talking softly. He saw Beatrice on the porch, writing in her journal. He saw the whole house breathing life, love, purpose, and he understood, finally, that the true healing hadn't come from an external miracle. It had come from the courage to face the pain, the humility to ask for forgiveness, the generosity to show up, and the persistence to stay even when it was difficult. Years later, when Gabriel and Matthew were adults, they returned to that garden. Gabriel was a physical therapist specializing in post-traumatic rehabilitation. Matthew was a neurologist working alongside Dr. Hayes at the Presence Project, which now had units in 12 countries. They sat in the same spot where it all began, with the original bag of clay between them. Gabriel, can you believe we made it this far? Matthew smiled. I always knew we'd go far, I just didn't know it would be this far together. They sat there, in silence, remembering the boy who couldn't see, and the boy who came to teach him how to see. Remembering the family that almost lost itself but chose to find each other again. Remembering that, in the end, it all came down to a simple but profound choice. The choice to show up, the choice to stay, the choice to love. And so, with a handful of clay and a ton of courage, they had proven that the improbable was possible, that healing was real, and that sometimes the truest miracles come wrapped in the simplest packages, carried by people who choose, against all odds, to believe. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Gabriel, Matthew, Edward, Beatrice, and Mrs. Rose has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey, of pain, forgiveness, and reconstruction, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you the most. Was it Edward's transformation, Matthew's courage, Beatrice's strength, Mrs. Rose's wisdom? Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, which show that it's never too late to start over, and that love can heal what medicine cannot reach. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, with more stories that will make you believe in the power of presence and human connection.